Yeah, we are spending a lot of time testing equipment and athletes in the wind tunnel, on the road, or in the velodrome. But how should like an hobby amateur athlete go along to judge if something is more aerodynamic than anything else?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, how about first we throw it at Björn. Björn, you've done a lot of work, a lot of bike fittings, a lot of support with your triathlon club, helping people get faster. So throwing it at you, how do you evaluate? How do you choose material? How do you evaluate what's faster?
Like me personally, I have a lot of resources that I can use, measurement equipment and stuff. But I think in general, people, they tend to trust someone. It's hard for them. You can read a lot, and at some point you have to decide this is who I trust, and you just go for it and believe it's faster, hope it's faster, and just use it.
So it's like it's a good point, right? Because people are investing thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of euros into equipment, but they don't really know if it's faster. So, I mean, one thing I often say in podcast interviews, whatever, is the challenge we face is like every brand thinks they have the fastest equipment. So every brand will say, we have the fastest wheels and we have the fastest bike frame, but is it faster, and how can an amateur, how can a consumer really measure it? So I would say let's break it down. Let's break it down into what can you actually measure and what is a guaranteed win, and what is really dependent on you, the rider. So I'd say wheels, 100% guarantee. It doesn't matter who's sitting on the bike. Doesn't matter what bike frame you put the wheels on, it's going to be a gain. And I think there's plenty of resources available, published online. There's more and more wind tunnel tests, independent wind tunnel tests that are done. So again, I keep referring back to Tool Magazine, but they're the magazine that's been doing the most independent testing over the last 10 years. But look for data, published data of wind tunnel testing. Again, bike frame. Bike frame, we'd all agree, a faster bike frame is faster for everyone, regardless of who's sitting on it. Adrian, agree from your side?
Yeah, I totally agree. And especially for road bikes, it does not matter like who sits on the bike.
So, okay. So again, say Tool Magazine test, look for data, look for independent published data. So wheels, bike frame, 100% guarantee. Suits and helmets.
So suits, that's a tricky one, because when we test with athletes and in general, we see some difference. Generally, if we have a better suit, it works better also on different body sizes, let's say. A rule that we generally use is if you have a suit that's faster from 5-10 watts, it's going to be faster for you. The absolute number might change, but if we say a suit is faster, it's going to be faster for you. But one thing to consider here maybe is speed. When you speak about suits and textiles, you have the shape of your body. That's as important as the speed you're riding at. A suit that might be designed for 45, 50 kilometers per hour will likely not be working as good for someone at 30, 35. So again, you have to trust someone, but if you do your research, you can also find at which speed it's been developed for. And for example, base layers are out there at low and high speed, and suit, again, if you're looking at TT or triathlon, the speed you're looking at and the speed for which the suit have been designed are not the same, and that's, I think, a good point for you to look at.
What does this mean? Does this mean that like an athlete who wants to buy a suit needs to go to the wind tunnel?
Not necessarily. The best thing would be to go to a wind tunnel, but we know that's expensive and that you cannot really do it. But I think we also come back again to trust. If a brand has tested the suit on multiple athletes, and I think that's where we also test, for example, the calcium we tested on 5 to 10 athletes. Correct me if I'm wrong.
I think we're now at like 15. We're now at about 15 athletes.
Yeah, so we test around 15 athletes. So you can trust that the calf sleeves work on a lot of different shapes of legs, because everybody has different legs and body sizes. And yeah, I think that's, if you have a number of athletes that have been tested and you have a range, believe that range. If you have a specific number, that might be really just for one specific athlete, but in general, it can work for everybody. but you also have some way of testing, I think.
Yeah, I mean, just briefly on the suits before we get to how to test them, I think, like you say, for example, Castelli has a ultra high-speed suit that's for like velodrome use and time trialing, right? It's super slick, it's super smooth everywhere. I can say absolutely 100% sure that will work if you're doing 50 plus kilometers an hour, and it absolutely will not work if your target speed is 35 kilometers an hour. And so I think this is where sort of education is important. I mean, Kevin, you talked a lot in a previous podcast about, roughness. So, particularly if you're a low speed athlete, and low speed, I mean, a normal amateur doing a triathlon, for example, or a normal road race where you maybe have a 30, 35 kilometer an hour average, well, then you need a lot of roughness on the arms, for example. But I think the point remains that for suit choice, for helmet choice, it's really hard. There's no guarantee. So you have to do some form of testing. So how do we go about testing? So yes, best place, go to the wind tunnel. But to do a decent chunk of testing, you need 3 hours, 2-3 hours in the wind tunnel. That's going to cost you a pretty penny. But one promise we make at Twistside is that any product we develop will be measurably faster, and I think that can apply to any product. So if a brand says this is faster, you will be able to measure it. So how do we measure it? And I think the best way is on a longer ride. So if you have a new suit and you go out and do not a 4-kilometer ride, but a 40-kilometer ride, and you ride the same power, you will be faster over that distance with your new setup. So I think there are very simple ways that don't require a wind tunnel by just going out and riding. Of course, you need to be riding on comparing two things on similar days. You don't want to have one day where you're riding in really windy condition and the next day that's wind still. So the best would be on one day, you go out and ride 20, 30 kilometers, change 20, 30 kilometers, and hopefully you should be able to measure a measurable difference in the performance.
Yeah, I think it's anyway good practice to have like a standard training course that you ride regularly. With new equipment, you will see pretty soon that equipment is faster or slower. But yeah, don't just do one ride. Maybe consider multiple rides with the same equipment to really have a good average.
Yeah, like the key is do repetitions. Like always in testing, in wind tunnel testing, in velodrome testing, and outdoor testing, repetitions are key to make sure you're not measuring something, but you're measuring what you're really digging into. And in general, the more scientific you do it, the more variables that you can eliminate. It's always good to get the best results. I think that's really important. But otherwise, do your loops. Do it consistently, keep everything the same, but the one thing you want to check, and then you will be able to measure it eventually.
I think that's a really good point that you measure is repeatability. So using a wind tunnel correctly is the same of how do we do testing repeatably? How do we do testing correctly? The wind tunnel is just a tool. Doing a test outdoor is just a process, but it's about how do we do this repeatably. And I think, like you mentioned, doing configuration A, B, C, and then repeating configuration A, B, C. And ideally, when we're in the velodrome, we typically do 3 times each configuration to get a clear vision as to what is faster. In the wind tunnel, we absolutely do the same thing, because over 2 hours in the wind tunnel, an athlete's shape does change, and that does impact the results. So, if we try 4 or 5 different suits and 4 or 5 different helmets, we come back and test the best 2 suits at the end, really to reconfirm if they are faster, and you always do see a difference. So, it's also about the robustness of your measurement and how you go about testing it.
So what's the minimum equipment you need for an outside test?
Really good point. So you need a power meter and a bike computer that's recording your time and your speed and your power. And I think with a simple Excel spreadsheet, of course there are some cool tools, apps and so on that you can get online that can help you evaluate your data. But I think the most important thing is, if you've got your power data, you've got your speed and you've got your time. You should be able to see for these things for the same power or the same time. So for the same power, you have less time. For your reference course, or for a fixed speed, you have less power. Then you know you have a better setup.
If you want to be a little bit more advanced in outside testing, and there are these aero devices, CDA meters out there. If you consider to get one, what should you look for, maybe?
Yeah, I think the holy grail are these CDA meters. There are a few on the market right now. 100% sure is that they will come. Currently, they're not super reliable, but it's just a question of time. We have one for our internal testing, which isn't on the market, but we can say that it's possible to do very good testing. Key is wind. We've talked a lot about sailing effect, the impact that has on reducing your aero drag. So you've got to be able to measure the wind at the same time when you're doing these tests. Once that's one of the problems with some of these devices, that they don't measure the crosswind at all. So ideally, on a wind still day, you do your comparisons. Then you at least get the wind out. A relatively flat course also helps. And then these devices, I think, are quite useful. But yeah, there's still a little way to go, I think, before we have really reliable devices on the market. But I would say in the next 2, 3, 4 years, we should be at a point where, I think most amateurs wouldn't need to go to the wind tunnel. Instead, they can use such a device.
Yeah. And also, like, the best device does not help you if the protocol of your testing is not good enough. So Björn already mentioned it. You have to do scientific testing for good results.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think what we can add here is really to emphasize on the fact that if you test suits or helmet, your sailing effect is going to be lower than or none compared to what you have on a bike or a wheel. So if you can go to a velodrome and do a lot of laps, because again, we're speaking about multiple kilometers, you want to have the most repeatable conditions, and also your course, if you choose a course outside, should not be too technical, because if you change your braking between the first course and your second course and you've done it 4 times, and on the 4th course you actually improve your braking, you might measure other differences. So try to find a course that's as a circle as possible without too much technical difficulties, and just be really consistent when you do your testing.
I think you raised a really good point there. I think probably the best place to evaluate suits and helmets is in the velodrome. There, I think you have controlled conditions, and if you get a better suit and a better helmet set up, as well with your whole cockpit setup, you're going to have you'll be able to measure it probably best in the velodrome. Of course, in the velodrome, you don't have the crosswind effects, as you mentioned, so there are some limitations there, but in terms of making clear measurable gains, it's a very good way to do it, probably quite cost effective as well.
Yeah, and when we talk about testing in general, maybe one thing to add is also that it makes sense to test at the speed that you're traveling at in competition as well. It's harder, or the differences are smaller at lower speeds. But anyways, as Kevin mentioned earlier, it does make a difference, especially for suits and stuff, if you're testing at a different speed than what you're actually traveling at in the competition. So I think that's really important.
Yeah. So as a quick summary, if you want to measure the performance of your new equipment, typically wheels and bikes, you don't need to do specific testing. You can trust information from valid independent sources that are published online. However, if you want to test if your new suit, helmet, cockpit position is faster, you need to do some form of testing. The ultimate is in the wind tunnel, but it's very expensive. Velodrome is a good option for suits and helmets, but otherwise, even testing outdoors on a relatively wind-still day, on a typical longer course, comparing 2 configurations, ideally multiple times, you should see that you're faster or use less power with your faster setup.
And don't be afraid of going outside and test equipment, build your own experience.
All right, how about some aero tips for our listeners? One quick pass down the table. Kevin, you kick off.
I'll go with one we already briefly touched on. work on your position, put yourself in your home trainer in front of a mirror, try to not decrease your power, but reduce your frontal area and then spend time outside to just run and be comfortable at different wind condition, try to have the deepest wheel and just go out there and reduce your frontal area.
Okay, so position optimization. From my side, look, I'm going to have to toe the company line and talk about wheels. Wheel tire system, super important for aero performance, particularly sailing effects. There's big gains, and wheels are cool. They make the bike look cool. They make the handling look well as well as performance. Remember, handling is key in the wind. Make sure you feel confident with your wheels, with your wheel depth. And don't forget, the tire is really important for aerodynamics.
My favorite is shave your legs. It's almost for free.
What if the house rules don't allow shaving legs?
If the house rules don't allow shaving legs, then the only choice are calf sleeves or the UCI legal socks, depending on your discipline.
It's a benefit anyway, right?
It's a benefit anyway, also with shaved legs. Stay tuned for more infos.
My aero tip for you guys is definitely when we're talking about triathlon setups, that you don't put any bottles in your frame, so on the down tube or the C tube. There are way better options to put your hydration, and I'm also talking about aero bottles.
So no aero bottle.
No aero bottle, no round bottle. If you can leave it out, don't put it in your frame.
Where do you put it instead?
You put it behind your saddle and you put it on the cockpit.
Nice one. Aero tips.